Thank you for being here, coming in from Delhi. We have Sanjana, who's joined us from Goa, who you may have heard from earlier in the first artist talk that we had today, and Ricardo from Ephemeral Tomorrow, also from Italy, who's here and presenting a piece actually here at the festival. So I would like to take the opportunity and invite you guys maybe to introduce yourselves, if you would like to.
Hello, I'm Lakshita. I practice creative technology and I work with microcontrollers and touch designer-based frameworks. I also run a makerspace in Delhi. It's a community makerspace. We teach robotics to children, have woodworking, workshops, everything that's to do with making, 3D printing, laser cutting. So building community is a big part of my practice. I'm also a trained social designer, which is a post-colonial form of design. Yes, I'm looking forward to the panel.
Hi, I'm Sanjana. I go by the artist name Optic Bloom. I was originally trained as a wildlife illustrator and a botanical artist, and now I've shifted into the VJing space. So currently I work as a visual artist at music gatherings, raves. I've also worked on a wildlife board game around conservation and a mushroom field guide for Bangalore's fungal landscape. So yes, so happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Ricardo. I work as an educator, freelance educator in Berlin and in Salzburg. And I'm also into touch designer quite a lot. I have, as Kunal said, a new media artists collective called Ephemeral Tomorrow. We are exhibiting a project in the silo. Yeah, what else? I also work as a creative technologist in a company called Field.io, doing design. And yeah, happy to be here. Thanks a lot, Kunal, for involving, and thanks to the Sixth Sense for organizing all these great events.
Of course, so I think, first of all, thanks everyone for being here. I think it's kind of obvious that this world of generative visuals and new media coding, touch designer specifically, is what's kind of tying us together. I think all of you use touch designer. We're here at the touch designer sessions, and that kind of addresses the technology aspect of this. So I think I would like to directly jump into the nature, and how that ties in with technology. And maybe it's a nice idea to start with what your experience with being in nature has been, maybe your immediate surroundings and upbringing. So for maybe with Sanjana, I know that you're based in Goa, and you've developed a lot of your work there, which is a protected belt, a green belt in India, lush nature. So maybe you can kick things off and tell us what your experience has been being so close to nature.
I think nature is core to my practice. Like, in a way, I draw a lot of inspiration from nature, and that's always been the case. Doesn't matter what the medium was. The mediums have changed over time, but I think there's this sort of childlike curiosity that I am in this space when I'm in nature, when I'm near a waterfall or river. There's a sort of like an energy around that space that is really inspiring for me. And I often, I'm just visual first person, so I notice a lot of things in nature that somewhat in a subliminal way affect my creative process. So I think everybody has that connection to nature because we are nature. We often look at ourselves not as nature as another thing, and we kind of have been separated from it because of the current urban spaces that we live in. And living in Goa was a conscious decision because a lot of my work happens a lot behind the laptop. I love spending time outdoors, but it's so hard to like balance the two worlds. And I love both the worlds, the digital and the natural. But I see that somewhere you can't help it sometimes, your work keeps you in the city and you have to find a way to be close to nature if you really feel for it. And that's where I somehow found a way to be in Goa. Yeah, so that's right.
So you could say, I think, fairly that you've been observing nature for a while now. And I think that's quite interesting because I've often thought that there's two ways to look at something. One is when you're observing it, but sometimes it's necessary to be a participant in something. And Ricardo, I know, for example, I've known you for 2.5 years now. I know in Italy you actually have a little bit of an olive farm, and every year you're traveling back to do a bit of harvesting, etc., which kind of makes you, well, it's a farm at the end of the day, but there's some kind of participatory element in the way you care for these plants and also harvest the fruit at the end. I'm just wondering, is that in any way different from being an observer of nature and our natural environments?
So yeah, as you said, so I grew up in a very small village in Italy, next to the sea. And yeah, as you said, so we have an olive farm, and every year it's really important to me. It's like a kind of mantra for me to go back that week where we harvest olives, and you have this kind of community aspect also. You have like all the family members gathered in a ritual that goes for centuries, and it really connects yourself to the land also and to this activity of olive picking, especially when you live in a big city like Berlin or Bangalore, I guess. Sometimes I really suffered this connection with nature. So yeah, you can call it observation. Like I refer to this like when you are in a big city, you become an observer. You are not in nature, but you are kind of studying or being affected by it. But when you're in the countryside, you establish this direct connection to the place and to the location where you are, which then reflects also in my personal work. So I personally like to work a lot with site-specific elements. So I put, the location where the artwork would be as at the core of the concept of the work. And of course you do then an activity of research that then become observation, but then I think before that, the inspiration is the element that really is the source of the concept, I think. And in order to do that, you need to be there and you need to experience that specific space. And being, nature or city, I think there is this kind of connection with a location that, in my opinion, comes first than the actual observation. I can also say that, so my mom is a scientist, she's a biologist, so I was always surrounded by scientific magazine. So I got since when I was a kid, like this kind of scientific approach to a lot of things that maybe my friends didn't have at the time. Something that I then rediscovered years and years after in my practice, that somehow connect to the scientific methodology of also like observing nature and measuring nature. So even in that activity, I think the natural element is quite important. And I think, being kind of growing up in an environment where it's wild, let's say, or different from completely urbanized environment, that's maybe reinforced this kind of process, I would say. I don't know if if it makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think you made this point about growing up in a big city versus the countryside. And I can say, well, I wouldn't say Goa is necessarily countryside, but kind of leaning towards it. Lakshita, on the other hand, you've been in Delhi for a long time. So I wonder how that perspective, where do you get your inspiration for the natural elements from in a city like that, which is big, can be brutal, can be loud, and in many ways the antithesis of what we consider natural.
A lot of my work is not nature-based, but it's again like more intersectional in terms of it intersects mythology, it intersects ecology, it intersects human rights. For example, what I'm wearing here, this is part of an installation that is called Padma, which was first conceived at Burning Man 10 years ago. And it's a biofeedback installation where you put your hand on it and it pulses to your heartbeat. And the idea behind it is that when people spend enough time with each other, their heartbeats start to sync with each other. So for its 10-year anniversary, we took it to the pyramids of Giza. And this rendition of Pulse and Bloom, which is called Padma, is they were blue lotuses that were taken from the deserts of Rajasthan to the deserts of Sahara, right under the pyramids of Giza. And there is also an old Egyptian mythology that talks about how when the blue lotus comes back to the land of Egypt to rise again, a new heart-centered world consciousness is going to emerge. And this also mythology also ties back to the ecological realities of the fact that the blue lotus is not growing in the Nile River because the river is toxified. So along with our friends in Egypt called Mona Rabi, and they do conservation work and they do a lot of water-related work for which they call the Waterman of India, Rajinder Singh, from India all the way to Egypt to work on the water pollution levels at the Nile River. And so this is how, for me and for my work, art, technology, mythology, and like also ideology kind of come together. Blue lotus is also an entheogen, and it's also the flower of death and rebirth for the Egyptians. So yeah, that I mentioned that because later on in the panel, I'd like to touch upon how entheogens and like our experience with altered states of consciousness and our perception of nature in those states are like translatable with something like Touch Designer. I'd also like to add that I live in Delhi, right? And for me, I'm also from the mountains originally. So the difference between being in the mountains and being in Delhi is a difference of reality. Like Delhi is not a real place for me. When I'm in the forest, I feel like I'm in a real space. There's truth here, there's beauty here. When I'm in Delhi, I feel like I'm in a hyper-real space. Hyper-real is also like a concept by French philosopher Jean Baudrillard. Excuse me if I'm not saying it right, it's a French name. And he talks about orders of simulation, right? And also a lot of new media, I want to touch upon this and I want to hear everybody's thought about it, that's why I mentioned this. Taking inspiration from nature, and for example, the kind of work you do, where you take like the data from natural worlds and turn it into installations, in my opinion, is a real high form of simulacrum, which is a simulation of nature cut off from its reality, right? And when you get to that high level of simulacrum, there's also like other kinds of negative aspects related to it. For example, like we're representing nature in art, but it's also cut off from the realities of nature, like decay, like death, like mosquitoes, like smells, like rot. So, and on the other hand, like I mentioned, entheogens and like being able to portray those epiphanies of interconnectedness, right? These are like high forms of simulacrum and hyperreal on one side, and like being able to portray the interconnectedness of nature on the other side in terms of how nature inspires new media. Yeah, I would just like love to hear what you think about all of that.
Okay, so I didn't get if this was a question, but So yeah, when, I don't know, when approaching nature, I feel that, so first of all, one parenthesis, I was very impressed of the wilderness of the life that you have in Bangalore. Like the first day we visited the festival, there were monkeys attacking us, eating. And this was something that actually, yeah, like moved me quite a bit and into like thinking on, oh, okay, there are like some contexts where these two man-made worlds and natural world, wild world merge, and sometimes in a productive way, sometimes, most of the times, maybe in a I don't know, sustainable way, I would say. But coming a bit on your, to your point, I feel that, yeah, like, of course, there's a connection on between technology and nature in terms of, I don't know, technology is advancing and we are discovering more and more nature, the nature around us. Climate change was a topic that came out, I don't know, in the 80s, was ignored, it's still ignored, but it's something that we are facing more and more, and there are more and more researches about how we are misbehaving in terms of how we live and how we produce and how we sustain ourselves. So many of our works, actually, we also try to include this kind of, this aim of also like making people sensitive to some topics that happens without our controls. Like climate change, for example, it's happening on a scale that it's not conceptible in a human brain. So it's like something that it goes beyond what you can perceive, what your body can perceive. It's obviously going faster and faster. But each time we try to, take one aspect of one phenomenon, for example, that we research, in order to make an artwork that maybe on the first glance doesn't connect directly to that event. Maybe you need to spend more time to get to that point, but maybe the aim is making people curious about, okay, this is cool. Are you using some live data? Oh yeah, you're using some live data. What is it about? Okay, it's about, I don't know, we did a lot of works about satellites, solar winds, earthquakes. So then on the second step, most of the people are kind of touched in a parallel way. So maybe if you face them with a text talking about how much we are polluting our environment with satellites, they wouldn't get interested into that. But if you maybe make an audiovisual artworks that generates some sort of mood that people can kind of connect to, then for many of them was much easier to connect to your actual initial concept, which is, I don't know, the data set that you use, for example. I remember one kid which we did this piece about satellites that he was amazed by this laser moving like they move the satellites, and then he asked his parents, oh wow, are these stars moving like this? And then the parents said, no, these are satellites, artificial objects that we put in the sky that actually cover the sky, the stars. So it was a kind of indirect way that we approached the topic, for example, which I found, touchy, at least from my perspective. I didn't expect that this reaction, for example. I don't know if I answered your question or your observation, but maybe I went a bit like that, but
I mean, you are always welcome to diverge from the route that we're on. That's why we're here. I think it's very interesting, like some of the things you talked about, and already I have a few questions. One is, like you talked about, how we can make these beautiful artworks that make people curious, right? And this is something that has always fascinated me as well, because I also studied science, and in India, traditionally you study science till 12th grade usually. Now things are changing. And I always found it very complicated to look at these graphs and tables and these very scientific methods of collecting data. And now as an artist with an art practice, I find it really funny that we use technologies to make super complicated information, and then we're using technology again to super simplify it. So I'm wondering if this is some kind of redundant loop that can be broken, or if there's a different approach to it, because, for example, there's Artem in the room behind us, who's a biologist, who's very effectively using his data to make some meaningful artwork. But as someone who's not, let's say, science savvy, I might misinterpret, or what I consider art could be a misinterpretation of actual scientific method and scientific data and fact. So how do we make sure that we're representing things correctly through, I also know all of you have had very interesting collaborations with actual scientists and people who are in the field, practitioners of other kinds of art forms.
So I guess the question is a bit about coherence in nature-generated artwork. Yeah, I think it's so. There are two things. So there is always like a scientific roof above what you do that you shouldn't break, I would say. But there's also like the artistic kind of practice. And the artistic practice sometimes goes against the scientific roof that you put on top of yourself. I think that at the end of the day, you need to generate an emotion in the viewer that sees your works, or at least that's my kind of interpretation of how I work. And I think that that's actually the point. Like if you move an emotion in your viewer, then it's a kind of chain effect that connects to curiosity, that connects to a lot of people spending time in your installation. And I think, yeah, that's, at least for me, the aim of our works. It's like generate that emotional connection to abstract, empirical, scientific data set. Let's say you can see it like that. Yeah, so moving emotion, I would say, moving emotions, at least.
I think that's always been a dilemma for me. Like, I love nature, but I'm using technology, and kind of how the narrative around humans is currently about we destroying nature, we also being nature, and that kind of confusion that creates in our mind about this kind of guilt that we carry within the world that, you know, where are we headed? I think we all have that existential thought. And I've carried it for many years now, and I think I have looked at it through the lens of my creative practice, and I think eventually you have this feeling of like helplessness at times, like what are we doing? Where is it headed? And that's why, I mean, working in a space like creating a wildlife board game, which is really rooted in like scientific data, research, all of that, and it has like actual representations of these animals, and you know, using like for the mushroom field guide identification. So I think like that has its place, and we must look at it like that. But for me, over time, I started understanding that, I mean, when generative art happened and it just sort of influenced the way I was creating work, I started looking at abstraction in nature as well, and not something like what is the impact I'm going to have and how can I measure this impact through a creative process, because you can't really have a measurable, you know, thing that, oh, this has had this impact. But it's mostly like looking within and seeing what you care about and how you see the world, and if you can show people the way you see, maybe they'll connect to you in some way, maybe. And I think there is no, I'm not looking at impact anymore in that way, and it's just like being a small part of something bigger, like a bigger movement. And there is a movement happening in which we are going back to nature in different ways. And I think using technology in that aspect to look at nature in a certain way that we can, again, reconnect with it. I think it's not just about having like the best technology or like, you know, it's not in isolation. I think it's about the beauty and the message. So if both of them are balanced well, it can be a powerful tool for transformation. And I don't see it as a black and white space. I think there's a lot of grays that you have to look at where we are headed, I think, as a collective consciousness. And also, I think the senses bit is something that I think about a lot, about senses of not only how we view the world, but how other animals that inhabit this space view the world, and kind of putting the human not at the center of it all, but looking at how other species can also, I mean, perceive reality. How do you, I think there's something there in which technology can come in and help us understand that better, and that creates a sort of empathy towards other beings in nature. It's all, yeah, I think so. I don't think it's like technology versus nature. I think it's kind of starting, it kind of is one thing and depends on how we use it. Yeah.
You have something to say? Okay. So again, so many questions coming up, and I have to pick the right one to take this conversation in that direction. But I think the first one that comes to my head, because Ricardo, you mentioned emotion, and Sanjana, you said connection. And for me, again, this ties back to something we were talking about earlier, observer, participant. And again, for me, this idea comes up about performance. And usually when I think of emotion, I think of, there's always a performance that usually sparks some kind of emotion in me, or I form some kind of connection to. And I think especially like Lakshita, your work is, there's also a lot of performative elements, collaborations in that regard. So I have a curiosity of if that is something that sparks some interest. And for Sanjana as well, it's a different kind of performance where you're VJing, and I think that's also a performance at the end of the day. So I'm kind of curious about this triangle of inspiration from the natural element, some kind of technical wizardry, let's say, and the performative element, and how these three things can kind of be leveraged to create this medium or emotion or connection that you're talking about.
So I do perform with Touch Designer, but my performances are usually with custom electronics that I've built. So it could be LEDs, it could be custom-made Gobo projectors. For me, just like Sanjana, I don't see nature as different than reality, and as different than even technology is part of nature for that matter. With my performances, I work with a lot of dancers. I collaborate with the dancers quite a bit. So I'm at the background doing the tech with the music, and then the dancers doing, and I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly, but I've had experiences of a room full of people where they have felt that with the dancer, with the music, and with the live tech stuff that I'm doing, that an entity is actually come to be present in the room. So again, like I don't know if it's on a tangent again, but performance can definitely be a tool to, like, in this room, for example, to like bring about an idea or an entity or an experience, and have the capacity to have everybody experience the same thing. And herein also lies the power of, again, the creative technology in terms of if you're using your field drawings, for example, how, and that goes back to the question I asked earlier about subliminal messaging to the other panel, like with your, even with VJing, even with your artworks, what is the subliminal messages that you're putting forward? Because at one point, especially using something like Touch Designer, which I consider highly intuitive, I think Touch Designer is a very, very intuitive tool and has, at one point, has a life of its own. How do you use that to bring about, in this context, like an ecological consciousness?
I don't think I'm trying to bring about ecological consciousness. I don't think I have the capacity as an individual to do that. I think it's a collective responsibility, and we play our part in small ways by being authentic to ourselves, our creative practice, what we believe in, and eventually that translates into something that over time, if you keep doing, exploring, maybe resonates with some people. But I think it's not about, I mean, for me, I've started looking at it not in terms of what the impact is or what it's going to do, but the doing itself. And I think you put yourself in that. I mean, with VJing as well, it's a really intensive process where you're working really late nights, you're preparing for a show for a long time. It takes a lot of energy from you, and I think that creates this sort of, and when it's received by the audience, and when you were imagining it in a certain way, that the show is going to look a certain way, but when it's received by the audience, you do, I think what I love about it is that constant feedback, like you're interacting with the people in the room and seeing what they see in what you created, and oftentimes it can be something different that they see, right? So I think I don't have like the ecological impact bit. It can be done in, I mean, I don't know if you have a control over that, but you can constantly go back to yourself and understand why you're creating what you're creating. And I think, first of all, it happens for yourself, and then it kind of moves into a more collective space. So, yeah, I think that's how I see it for now.
So, regarding performances, I personally, I don't like to be in a stage, so I don't feel so confident or comfortable being on a stage. So that this connects a bit to some live performances that we did, which in part are real-time generated by data. So you at least give half of what you have to do, the responsibility, you give it to the data that you use, essentially. So if something goes wrong, it's because of the data, you know, it's have no control, whatever. But there is this kind of real-time feedback aspect that I also really appreciate, that connects a bit to improvisation, in my opinion. So you also need to be good in improvising. And also, like, I don't know, personally, the music performances that I appreciate the most are the ones that are improvised, which connects also a bit to the aim of most of our works, are also works that are being site-specific. You need to improvise all the time with what you have on location. Most of the time it's very challenging, it's really hard, but that's, in my opinion, the beauty of it. So I think, yeah, this idea of improvisation, at least for me, it's what I like the most from the live performances in general. I don't know, from live performing, I like improvising when I have to do it.
I'm thinking about, both of y'all talked about responsibility, right? So, and I agree that the power does not, it's a larger problem that needs to be addressed by the system, but us at the people who are creative technologists at the intersection of art and technology, technology that is leading the human evolution, and art which is like a way shore for human evolution, and this might be a little little bit of a self-indulgence, but I feel like creative technologists stand at a place where you can really speculate or direct the evolution of humankind in a certain way, because you understand art, you understand technology, and then you have a medium through which you can communicate those knowledges and wisdoms with the people. So, and again, like the question lies in power. Who has the power? Do I have a power as the artist? Is it the company that's making my technology? Does that have the power? Is the power with the gallery who's funding my artwork? Is the power, does the power lie with the people who are consuming that artwork? Are those people really impacted by the stuff that I'm talking about? Or like, it's the question. There's no real answer to it. Where does the power lie? And also, where does the responsibility lie? You know, and yeah.
So, I mean, that's again a very relevant question, and is actually a very good segue for me to jump into the difficult part of this conversation, which is, to be very blunt, is there a lot of greenwashing happening today? Is it trendy to be inspired by nature? Is it convenient to say this is inspired by nature and get away with it? Or inspired by, I don't know, more traditional practices, more sustainable practices? And I think maybe, Ricardo, I know that you've also done some projects for bigger clients who have more of a global impact, just because of their presence globally, who often want to go in this direction. And I'm curious, how do you balance this? Because with Ephemeral Tomorrow, your work is very focused on representing data correctly, and you retain some of the power in the message that you put out.
Yeah, so it's also a bit greenwashing my soul with the projects that I do with my collecting. Because, yeah, unfortunately, that's the case, that a lot of those tech companies, they love nature-inspired projects, ideas. Like, bring me some reference from the wild, I don't know, animals, data about the sun, climate, whatever. So there is this big problem in general, and that's also a problem that I have myself with working in this industry. So I think, yeah, as I said, it's maybe also a reason why I care so much in doing like projects that are naturally driven, when I can do it with my own practice. I don't have any limitation, any client requests. I can do whatever I want. But yeah, I think that's a big issue, and yeah, I don't know. I don't know the solution for that. But I feel that the more and more we understand our effects on the climate, the more and more there is this intention from the bad guys to look like they are the good guys caring for the environment. So yeah, I'm not gonna name clients or big brands, but there is this tendency, unfortunately, yeah.
So, I mean, in contrast to that, Lakshita, you practice a lot of your artwork with more traditional artists who more often tend to use material that is locally sourced in abundance, and often also, especially, I mean, I know in India also acquired by more ethical means. Let's say we're not necessarily always working with iron ore or things like this. There's a lot of clay work and things like this in the practices that you do. So do you feel like that's you taking some power again in how your work is created, how your work is represented, and who is actually benefiting from your work? It's not, let's say, some big metal manufacturer who you're buying metal from, but local artists and artisans who benefit from your pieces.
Yeah, I collaborate with a lot of artists who then in turn collaborate with like local Indian craftsmen for be it weaving, be it brass work, be it archiving maps. So again, that's like a place where it's intersectional. Like you're also kind of honoring the tradition of Indian crafts, traditional crafts, you're honoring the high-tech, cutting-edge technology that is touch designer. You're also honoring again, you're kind of taking the power back in your hands, right? And I want to kind of go on another tangent and talk about goddess Lakshmi. And so goddess Lakshmi is the goddess of wealth, but wealth and abundance, but not just of material wealth, but also of wisdom, tranquility, and things like that. And she's also well known to be a Patal Nivasi, that is, she lives underground. She comes from the underworld, right? So, and she's the daughter of Asuras. Asuras and Devas in Hindu mythology can be akin to gods and devils, but in Hindu mythology, it's much more non-dual like that. Asuras don't, not in a Judeo-Christian way, don't mean demons, but they are basically forces of nature that live under the earth, right? And Devas and Asuras are always in conflict with each other because Devas are the forces that live above the earth, like water, like sun, like rain, like water, not water. Water comes from under the ground. So more than a fight between the good and the bad, it's a fight between the regenerative and the exploitative forces of nature. So in order for wealth, Lakshmi to come, wealth, prosperity, evolution, all of those things to come to being, there's always a descent to the underworld that's necessary. And that could be represented also in like mining the earth for natural resources, or plowing the soil for having crops. So I mean, I say this just to highlight the dichotomy like between the fact that we have to plunder earth in terms of, for there to be evolution, for there to be prosperity. But then again, Asuras, the so-called demons of the world, are also the knowledge holders of Sanjeevani knowledge, which is the knowledge of regeneration. So how do we, so in my work specifically, I look at, yes, I am buying 5 sheets of acrylic, which is never going to be recycled, but I'm also using, but what is the end goal to that? Is the end goal evolution? Am I creating some kind of impact that's ideological, if not like ecological? So yeah, it's not that a lot of my work does use things that can be recycled and are permanent, like stone or like brass, etc. But also I consciously do use a lot of plastic, and I have a lot of wastage because prototyping R&D is like, I don't want to hide the fact that you do have a lot of wastage. I have thousands of microchips sitting in my studio. I have I have a lot of plastic. Like my carbon footprint is through the roof. But for me, it's about how aware are you of that? Like how aware are you of the impact that you're making, not just in one sphere of ecology, but also in the other spheres of awareness, ideology, talking about uplifting the traditional crafts of India, etc. So to answer your question.
So I would like to extend this conversation to the audience who is here and invite them to be a part of it. But before I do, I would give you guys the opportunity to have any final thoughts, since
I actually like 2 points that you mentioned. One is the speculation, that I think it's a very powerful tool in order to move this sensitivity to certain topics, which is also connected to fiction and to ways of narration in a way. So you can also work a lot with imagining like scenarios that are moving some emotions. And I think that's one really good point, that we still have to move people's minds towards a more sustainable future, for example. And also responsibility. So this is also like using speculation to be responsible towards to what we are doing in terms of, yeah, our ecosystem, how do we live with our ecosystems. And that's also, and the other point was the community point that you mentioned multiple times, and I think that this is a very important point because it's a global aspect. There are community, this sense of communities in many cultures. It's mostly the same. Like you share some attitudes, some places, some routines, some mindsets. You share this idea with many of your people that you connect daily, and this is happening in many different societies. So if you kind of manage to work on the local community kind of scale, then you can always kind of move the society from the very bottom rather than from the very top. So I think, yeah, the main problem is that, yeah, again, the 1% of the society is utilizing the most of the resources. And this is something that, I don't know, also I noticed being an European coming to India, you have so many more sustainable ways to deal with trash than we have in Europe. Like, I don't know, for example, like all these plates that you have in wood, or like the way you use toilet paper, for example. It's much more, makes more sense to have something to wash your ass instead of tons of paper. This is, I don't know, the first thing that comes to my mind. But, you know, if India would live with the standards that we have in Berlin, the world would crash after a week, because there's no way that you can afford this. So, yeah, I don't know, maybe I think maybe 1/3 aspect is also traveling and discovering, being curious enough to discover different societies, different communities, and how different communities live. This is very important, at least from my past experience. Wherever I was, that was completely different from how I'm used to, I was moved into changing my behaviors towards something. And I think this is actually also at the kind of base of a change, I guess, I hope. So yeah, being curious and travel and knowing the world, I guess it's also like, yeah, one important point to move forward, but yeah.
I think like living close to nature, I wanted to talk about like the local, I think I completely believe that we all need to act locally. I think when we think of impact, we think at a very global scale. And if you're just making smaller changes, like for example, if you're working on a community-driven project, if you're working with some tribes in a forest, and you know, you're using that information to create a creative project, you can be a bit mindful of what you're giving back to the community instead of just being extractive. And I think it's being normalized to be very extractive. And as artists, we can have big egos as well at times and think that our vision is, you know, and I think collaborating with the communities to create projects can also be interesting, because you're not putting yourself as, you know, the main person, but like you're thinking about the community, the crowd. So definitely there's also that. And when we are talking about living in nature, and as you live in a farm or in the countryside, I think living close to nature is often fantasized about. But when I shifted to Goa, I have like very highly poisonous snakes around my house, and it feels like I'm threatened all the time, and I'm like, oh, I'm close to nature, and I've always dreamt of this. But I think it humbles you to live in nature as well. You start to respect it when you spend time with it. Maybe if you go for a trek or you're outdoors and, you know, you get stuck in bad weather, and then you realize how small you are, and it kind of puts you in the place. And often living in cities, we are so protected from these natural things that, you know, are such a big part of us. So I think we should all be out in nature more often and not see ourselves very separate from it. And like we can save the world, or we can save nature, we can save the planet. I think it's deeper than that. It's being connected to it first, and I think, yeah, that's.
Any closing remarks, Lakshita?
Yeah, I found it really interesting how you said that there's snakes actually in nature. So I only have questions. I don't have any answers. I only have questions. And my question is again, like, using for a scan of a forest or like natural patterns, etc., it cuts it off from the reality of nature. There are no poisonous snakes in the dome, right? So like, so again, that's again a question, right? Like are we using nature as a really high aesthetic, or are we actually using biomimicry? Because biomimicry is in levels, right? The first level is the form, the second is the function, and the third is the system, right? And biomimicry as a system becomes permaculture, and then those are actually, that's a way that we can actually measure impact. There are ways that we can measure impact. For example, life cycle assessments, for example, biomimicry to copy the pattern, the systems of nature to be able to grow food or like make stuff. So again, like these are all just questions and like things that are in my head that I also like to put in your heads. Yeah, that's all.
So, anyone else with questions?
I've used the power of the microphone to maybe make a comment, because you mentioned power. And I think it relates to critical thinking, right? If you're trained as an artist or you work as an artist, you question things and so on. You make it kind of hard for yourself. On the other hand, we have huge movements. You see it in the US now, where they say, fuck it, let's just drill, baby, drill. Like, there's no doubt. So I think the question is where the power comes from, and if the power tries to greenwash, we have an issue. But if you have small artists, who try to put out the seed of doubt, and then we start even doubting ourselves, are we actually bad because we use lasers and technology? I think we're looking at the wrong side, and that's exactly what power wants. Right, this whole thing, we all think about our own carbon footprint. In the end, it's a propaganda method to make every one of us feel guilty. Oh, I'm in it as well, so why should I point my finger at British Petroleum? I just flew to India to get to know people. I think this is a mechanism that works against us. So because the people who really have the power to change, they have no doubt. They move forward, they make the money. And we artists, then we carry all this load of having a bad consciousness. So I guess we should be then maybe also rather trying to get power impact, to have something against the real power that has no doubt. So anyway, just a comment, please. Comments, questions, interactions. Amen.
I think we have a question, Stefan.
You say it and then repeat it to them because they cannot understand.
Okay, yeah. So my question was, how do you structure your message and bring about awareness about these kind of topics? Because there's like a spectrum. Like, one is like just stop oil. They do like dramatic stuff, and like it kind of gets a negative from the audience. Like, people don't like that. They ignore it. They're like, why are they doing this? Like, you can tell it in nicer ways. But as an artist, you also want to create a sense of urgency. But if you try to do like dramatic things like that, it may not be well received by the audience, and like people may like want to stay even further away from that topic. But if you do it too subtly, then like there's no urgency. People like think about it, maybe forget about it, and like don't take any action against it. So how do you like position yourself in your messaging?
Could you acoustically understand the question? No. So I'll try to repeat it closer to you. So I think it's about how do you balance if you do it too subtle, they might not notice it. So how do you find the right balance? I hope that was about it.
I mean, again, maybe in our case, it's more about the emotion that you want to produce. So this emotion can be produced by something scary, but also by something nice. And in the end, I don't know. It's yeah, that's the tricky part that the artists need to deal with. I think it's more something what Stefan was saying, like this kind of power, kind of levels of power that you need to deal with in the process, because especially us utilizing that we use technology in order to produce our works, we need to compromise a part of it if we want to use that technology, but we also have the power to send a message. We use that technology to send a message or show the bad aspect of that technology if you want. So, I don't know. Yeah, I think it's tricky. It's definitely a tricky situation that you need to deal with if you're a new media artist. This kind of yeah, system that you are into, which is like the consumeristic society that forces you to change GPU every couple of years in order to run like a network if you want to. But I feel that there's still like possibility to do the same thing with a lower technology and producing the same message if you want to. Sometimes it's a matter of like what you can afford to. Like sometimes at least us we are forced to use certain low-tech strategies in order to do our work because we don't have money. But I don't think that yeah, like sometimes I appreciate more this kind of circumstance where you are forced to put yourself in an uncomfortable situation and work with what you have, than the situation where you can access to whatever resources you want. And yeah, maybe do a less meaningful artwork. So yeah, it depends about the message that you want to communicate, I think. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Like you said, it's about the message and the emotion you're trying to communicate. And there is also a difference I'd like to point out between negative and dark. Dark things aren't always, dark things are difficult to talk about, difficult to accept, but they're not necessarily negative. For example, Lakshmi is a very dark place that comes from the unborn, right? And for me, I don't think there's anything wrong with making your audience feel something dark. Like a dark emotion, if it makes them up to something that's the message, that's the message you're trying to convey. I don't think there's anything wrong with having intense, dark, creating those experiences. As long as the intention behind it is, like for example, nature is very dark. Right? Nature is snakes, nature is terrifying, nature can destroy you in seconds. So I think it's okay, even as artists, if you're creating like intense, difficult to feel experiences.
So,
Also, like maybe something that is done for you is not done for someone else.
yeah,
It's also a very subjective kind of yeah, topic.
I mean, I will answer this not as an artist because we have three wonderful artists here, but I can answer your question more in terms of someone who's been involved with the curation and co-production of this festival. I think we have managed to bring together artists who have some dark emotions, artists who paint a very positive picture, artists who paint a gloomy picture, performance, etc. So when you look at it from, of course, as an artist, you're entitled to showcase what you want to showcase, but there's also people who are not necessarily presenting or creating their own pieces, who are working in the ecosystem to make sure that every message can be received by the people who need to receive that message. So when you walk through this festival, and I invite you to do that in the next days, I'm sure that not every piece will speak to you, but there will be a piece that speaks to you. So there's also that angle of painting this message where it's not just one piece, but a collection that then you find which is your favorite flavor, like a box of chocolates, as Forrest Gump says, yeah. Any other questions, or Stefan, do we have time?
We have time, but we could also come to a conclusion if there's not like the burning issue that needs to be raised. We could also call it a day and discuss it in a smaller round.
Yeah, all right. Well, if there's no other questions, then thank you, Ricardo, Sanjana, Lakshita. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. And thank you guys. And thank you, Stefan, and the Node Institute and the whole team in Berlin, and of course the team from the Sixth Sense, and our lovely team at the console for making all of this happen. I hope I see you guys tomorrow as well. Have a good evening.